great pleasure to have Dr. Christopher Hood back here. It's been a while since we've seen him at the Daiwa Foundation. I suppose Cardiff is a little way away. But I think probably many of you in the audience already know about him, but I need to run you through his brief biography. So he is Reader in Japanese Studies at Cardiff University. He's written a number of books. I always think of Chris as a bit of a kind of trains, planes and automobiles man, but he has also written academic books such as Education Reform in Japan, so it's not all about trains, sometimes it's about training, I suppose. Sorry. and he's also written 3 novels, all set in Japan. And what I think you tend to find with academic books is that people can write books about their own narrow specialities, but it's only when you reach a position of great eminence and long experience that you can write a broad book like Japan, the Basics. So that's where Chris is now. He's eminent enough that he was president of the British Association of Japanese Studies for 6 years, and he has also received a commendation from the ambassador of Japan in the UK for his contribution in this field.
First of all, I'd like to thank Daiwa for very kindly hosting and inviting me to do this book launch. Also, I'd like to thank Routledge and Stephanie Rogers at Routledge, who's my contact, for her patience in the process of writing this book. There's a few of you here who are from the academic world and know how whatever we say to students about how deadlines are deadlines, when it comes to book manuscripts, deadlines are not deadlines, especially when COVID came along. So thank you for coming. So I'm going to be talking about a variety of things related to the book, by essentially taking you on a journey through the book. You still might want to get your own copy of it, but I will take you on a journey through the book. I'm basically going to be showing you photographs and also the tables and graphs from the book, so you get to see them on a big screen in colour. If you buy the ebook, they are in colour in that, but if you buy the paperback or hardback, they are in grayscale. You can see the colour versions are also on my website at a later date if you'd like to. There are going to be a few photographs in here which aren't in the book, as you will see in due course as well. So, first bit of the book is the dedication and acknowledgements. There are a lot of people I would like to thank, and please do take time to look through the acknowledgements. Some of you might actually recognise your own names in there as well. In terms of the dedication, though, there were 2 groups who I picked out. The first was actually my students, and particularly a group of students. This is some of them, not all of them. In fact, one of them is not in the photos in the room at the moment. We called ourselves the Costa Gang. This was because during a time of industrial action, we used to decamp to Costa and just chat about Japan and talked about the book and updating it from the first edition to the second edition, and their input was invaluable. But the interaction with students over the years has very much been a driving force of this book. So I think it's only appropriate that I dedicate the book partly to them. The other dedication is to a friend of mine who sadly passed away a few years ago now. It was friends like this, the ones that you first meet when you start dealing with Japan. You never realise it at the time as a 17-year-old, how much impact potentially they're going to have on your lives, because they may not be typical, but they still represent some aspect of Japan. They can introduce you to parts of Japan. And I think this aspect of the first people you deal with, the first book you read, we sometimes overlook just how significant those are, and this is a point I'll be coming back to. So, the book itself is structured into several chapters, but there is a preface which is all about establishing the basics. And for any students of mine watching online and for the ones in the room, you'll be used to the fact that I like to use some videos and stuff, so we are going to start with a video. So why am I showing you this video? There are a lot of books about Japan. Many of these, of course, are monographs on specialist topics and so on, but there are also other books which try and cover everything to do with Japan. And then Routledge approached me to do a book on Japan and said, we want you to do another book on everything to do with Japan. It's like, so how am I going to be different to those? Because despite the fact they approached me for the first edition, let alone the second edition, I still have to fill in the author questionnaire thing, and it's just like, who are the competitors going to be? Why is your book different? Why should we do this? And it's like, you wanted me to do it. Why am I answering this question? And I thought part of the issue with many books is we, as academics, naturally tend to focus on giving answers. But what is the question? What are the questions we should actually be arming our students with? And by students, I don't mean necessarily university students or school students. I mean anybody who wants to learn. What are the questions we should actually be arming people with to go out there and learn about a country, in this case, Japan? I hope that's what this book does. And it starts with the basics. This picture is not in the book, okay? What does the basics mean? The basics itself is a series done by Routledge. Almost anything you want to study, there should be a version of the basics. I like to think of it, I think it works well with the Japanese word, kihon. It's very much the foundation, okay? Basics, the English nuance sounds very too simplistic, I think, but the basics in Japanese is a really important principle. It's the basis of something. And this is something which you see in sumo. As you can tell from my stature and look, I'm obviously into sumo myself. And in sumo, shiko is the basics of everything. You can watch them train for hours and hours. Very basic movements, muscle memory being developed. And it was that sort of principle in mind that I started building the book from. But doing this and doing a book like this comes with issues for me as an author. As I said earlier on, when we first pick up a book, that book can sometimes end up influencing you the most. When I started doing research about the Japan Airlines crash of 1985, the first book I read was a book done by the Asahi Shimbun. And having read that one and thought, this makes sense, every other book I then viewed in terms of, does that fit consistently with the first book I read? If I'd read one of the conspiracy theory books first, who knows where I would have gone with that, with my research. So being the first is quite a big thing. And when you set up a book being called Japan the Basics, which by its very nature might be the first book that people read, that puts a lot of pressure on me at one level, and it's a little bit unnerving and terrifying, but also slightly exciting as well to think that I might be helping people on their journey. I know there are some people who don't necessarily regard textbooks as important as monographs and refereed journal articles and so on. But I'm really proud of having done this book, and I'm particularly proud of this second edition, much more than the first edition in many ways, partly because it does reach so many more people. And that, in the end, is what it's all about. As academics, we get to see and experience things which a lot of people can't do. And I think we have an obligation to then pass on that knowledge somehow or other. And the reality is, through a textbook, I can reach many more people than through most of my research articles and so on. And similarly, teaching in the classroom, either directly or indirectly, we can end up touching so many lives, and then also through blogs, social media, and so on. And this again provided a link to me working with the students to try and make this book as palatable for everybody as possible. So the first chapter, Studying Japan. Now, when I was approached to do the first edition of the book, Routledge basically said, although it's going to be called Japan the Basics, you can focus on anything you like. It could be international relations, whatever you want. Do whatever you like, which doesn't work for me. I'm one of those people where if someone says, you're doing the cooking tonight, I just want to be shown what's in the fridge and I will put something together. If someone says, go and pick what you need from the supermarket, just, I don't want to make decisions. It doesn't work for me. But whether it was because of my natural interests, my background, the teaching, I don't know. But things came together, and I thought that a good starting point was actually, if someone's picking up this book, they're not starting from zero. Everybody has some sort of knowledge of Japan, and that knowledge now is very different to what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, because there's much more anime and access to Japanese TV programs than there used to be. Many more people have visited Japan and so on, but we still have certain stereotypes, clichés floating around, and I thought, let's start from there. Not necessarily to say whether they are accurate or inaccurate, but let's just say, let's start from there and then see what we can do with them. And also just think about, why do some of these not change over time, some of the issues related with that. And I was able to then bring in some of my wider research interests as well. So part of it, and there are a lot of questions involved in this book, is actually just starting to think about who are these people? Who are studying Japan? Why are they studying it? What would they study? What should they even start learning about? And I don't think sometimes we stop to think about these questions enough, and I try to do that with this book. But very much my thinking of this book is it's the beginning, not the end. I hope that everybody will find the book useful, even experts on Japan. Hopefully, because of how I've got some of my more recent research in there, they will get something out of it. But I hope more than anything, people will use it as a springboard to go on doing additional reading about Japan, visit Japan, and so on. Obviously, when it comes to studying Japan, particularly if you go to visit the country, but just generally, we need to use our eyes. And this is one of the first pictures in the book. And this leads to a discussion in itself. Many of us in this room brought up in Europe. We're used to looking left to right. But in Japan, particularly historically, it's right to left. In other words, to see this image as the way, for example, Hokusai, who did the picture himself, would have interpreted it, we actually need to do that. And what you'll actually discover, and both versions are in the book, is that with this version, I suspect many of you who are used to looking left to right, Mount Fuji now actually looks a little bit bigger than it did in the previous image, but all I've done is just flip it. No other scaling or anything. Okay? So part of the discussion in the book is just saying you need to unlearn what you've been learning, potentially. You need to be prepared to see things differently. But you also need to be a little bit honest about things. I was particularly happy with this picture. It captures so much about Tokyo, doesn't it? We've got Tokyo Tower, the modernity of skyscrapers, but there's a temple, and we can get excited about the contrast. Japan's all about contrast. And it's just like, yeah, but I can go literally 2 miles away from here and get a picture of the Shard and St. Paul's in the same shot. You can get images like this around the world. But for some reason, when we go to Japan, we go looking for the contrast, maybe. And this, of course, is why stereotypes, clichés can keep going round. This chapter, I'm partly happy with the title, partly not happy with the title. I realized after setting the title that people are going to think, oh, he's a fan of Prince. I wasn't. Okay, it's nothing to do with him at all. But it's very much, this chapter is talking about symbols, different aspects of symbols. And I think I can also talk at this stage, one of the issues with this book is when you're dealing with a book which is, by the title, it's suggesting you're dealing with the whole country, trying to keep on top of everything is very, very difficult. You've got a book that's around about 70,000 words. And the news, things keep coming out. What do you include? What you don't include? It's always a bit of a challenge keeping up to date with particular things, even if you're focusing in on certain things. Things keep changing. Some things stay the same. Different picture to edition 1, but we still got the Shibuya Scramble Crossing because it's what we're used to. Yeah, practically any North American or European program that has some scene set in Japan, we're going to have the Scramble Crossing in Shibuya. What's interesting is if you watch Japanese TV programs and they want to say, and this bit is in Tokyo, they generally don't show the Scramble Crossing. They're more likely to go for Tokyo Tower, and these days a little bit more often also Tokyo Skytree. But for some reason, Scramble Crossing is still popular. When it comes to popular images of Japan, people would be very disappointed, of course, if I didn't have an image like this. This is part of the starting point for some of my research. I've done a book on the Shinkansen and the symbolism of the Shinkansen, and think about what can we learn from this image? What can we learn about Japan from the Shinkansen itself? The Tokaido Shinkansen is going to be in the news a lot in about 2 weeks' time. Yeah, just under 2 weeks' time. On the 1st of October, it will be celebrating its 60th birthday. Okay, high-speed rail rushing between Tokyo and Osaka, a distance roughly the same as London to Edinburgh, these days in 2 hours and 18 minutes. Yeah, we won't talk about British rails. The Shinkansen also allows us to start talking about other issues. Depopulation, the countryside emptying out. The big cities are getting bigger and bigger. The small cities, and by which I mean in Japanese terms, anything of 500,000 and less, are collapsing. Okay? People, I don't think, have really got their head around just how quickly the population is now going down in Japan. A few years ago, when I was talking to my students about it, it was around about 300,000 a year the population was going down, which is the equivalent of Cardiff being wiped off the map. Obviously, it's not in one place, it's across the whole of Japan. This last year, it was 700,000. That's Glasgow. Okay, within a year or two, it's going to be Birmingham. That's how quickly it's going down. Probably within my lifetime, we will get to the point where the UK population is going to be bigger than Japan. That is how much it is changing. And it's very, very obvious as you travel around now. And some of it is due to these things. Whereas they were meant to take people out to the countryside, they're actually now emptying out the countryside instead, as is in the book. This is one of the tables. I'm not going to talk to this particularly, but I just thought I put it in there so you can see it, but I can lead on to this one more. This shows there are actually regional variations in the fertility rate across Japan. And because I've been to all 47 prefectures, I quite like to talk about the variations across Japan, the regional differences and so on. Sadly, the nature is, I mean, I think all of us academics always do this. We sort of say, don't make generalizations. And then we spend the rest of the time making generalizations because it's very difficult to deal with specifics all the time. We would run out of space and words. But there are huge regional differences in a variety of different things, and it is important to recognize them. There are also big differences in prices. Okay, this is the price of land, residential land, for each prefecture. Guess which one Tokyo is for the people at the back. What I find most interesting about this graph is not the graph itself, but what it symbolizes. For somebody who did A-level economics and studied some economics at university and learnt all about market forces, whenever I go to Japan, I just think, doesn't work. If you want an example of a country where market forces does not work, just look at Japan, because everybody should be going out to the cheap land. Whereas what's happening is everybody going, I don't want to be here, I'm going to the city. Something is different for whatever reason. Okay. Another aspect of what goes on is because people are crowding into the big cities, as for those of us who have been to Japan knows, you end up with situations where it is short of space, a lot of people in rented accommodation, so it's difficult to have pets. And so various things are developed. And so there's some examples here of where it's a bit more cramped. These are actually some photographs which were also in the first edition. The main reason why this picture is here, the top left, is because of those are my children. This picture is from 10 years ago, and they're in the front row here. You can see them later. You'll notice they actually haven't changed in height or anything in 10 years. We clearly didn't feed them enough. But this shows some of the challenges, some of the results of space pressures within Japan as well. This table, which sadly I couldn't find any up-to-date data from sort of more up-to-date, talks to the issues of this burning question that so many people seem to have, or at least journalists seem to have, is Japan an expensive country? To anybody who's been in Japan in the last few months, oh boy, it's fun. It really is not expensive at the moment. The airfare, horrific. But when you get there, it is not expensive. But of course, so much does depend on the exchange rate. In the years I've been going to Japan, the pound-yen exchange rate has been between 105 and 295. It's a factor of 3 difference, basically. But that doesn't tell the whole story, because there are different lifestyles. And that's why I like this table. It points out that within countries, people aren't living the same way. So just looking at prices doesn't actually tell the whole story. The third chapter is called visual packaging culture. This is a term that I've been sort of using recently, and it's sort of an evolution from the work by Joy Hendry talking about wrapping culture. And it sort of can best be understood from this picture, which you'll immediately understand why. This next picture is not in the book. So this is from our cupboard at home. We know from looking at these cans what the contents are. Yeah, there's a visual understanding of the symbols. But there's an understanding, if you look at the left one, that given that it's got coconut milk in it, it probably doesn't also have those, what is it, carrots, peppers, cucumbers. We know that probably wouldn't be in there. That requires an additional bit of understanding. And so what I'm interested in and start to develop in this chapter is which things we just know inherently, which things actually require some sort of learning, which bits can be learnt by people who don't grow up in the country, or which ones take longer to learn. I touch upon this in the book, introduce it in the book. It's something I'm hoping to do as a future monograph in due course. Everybody's going to enjoy the next slide, I think. Who doesn't love Hello Kitty? Okay. Why would you do this to a Shinkansen? Transportation is usually about getting from A to B. Yeah? Let's just park that idea for a second. Another thing which is usually about getting to a destination is something called contents tourism. This is where people go to a place connected to a movie they like or a pop video so they can sort of see it for themselves and immerse themselves in the place. I've done contents tourism. I don't expect anybody in this room has seen this film from 2008 called Climbers High. It's based on a Japanese novel. It relates partly to the JAL crash of 1985, which is how I got to know about the book and then the movie. Contents tourism is about going to the place, being able to take a photograph which looks like, so the two on the left are from the movie, the two on the right are my own photographs. You try to recreate that. That is what contents tourism is about. But there are times when transportation may not be about the destination and contents tourism may not be about the destination. These are aeroplanes in Japan. I would like to suggest that maybe that top aeroplane is doing cosplay. It's meant to be C-3PO. Quite a well, no, I'm not going to say that, but we've been recorded. We'll talk afterwards about my views on this. But it comes back to that question I asked. Why would you put Hello Kitty on the Shinkansen? In my view, it's the wrong question. Why wouldn't you do this? It doesn't cost that much extra. They have to pay a little bit of branding money to Disney, who owns Star Wars or whatever, but the paint costs the same. Why wouldn't you do something fun like this? Particularly in a country where you see mascots everywhere and lots of fun things. Why not do it? Sometimes we have to flip the question the other way around. Chapter 4, nature. Okay, many Japanese people we know love nature, but there are other sides of nature. Environmental impact. There's also the impact by nature on Japan. Earthquakes, typhoons, whatever it may be. So this chapter covers a range of things related to a sort of subjects on this, including Japan's never-ending, extending list of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, which I suspect is already out of date. I'm sure they would have added another 2 or 3 by now. But it was also an excuse to bring in one of my favorite photos of the book. I was really happy to put this picture in because I spent, I kid you not, probably 2 or 3 days with the first edition debating about what picture to put in that time. Because I've been to this place twice, and the second time I went there, it was just full of foreigners and loads, and Japanese as well, but lots and lots of foreigners. Everybody taking pictures, and it's just like, do I want a picture which shows these macaques in the natural environment, concrete-made pool, by the way, or do I want to have one which shows people taking pictures? Which one do I want? And in the first edition, I went with the macaques only. This time I can do the other one so that I can point out there are people in the background. Listening to people's conversations, I found fascinating because everybody is doing the same sort of thing. It's just like, look at how similar they are to us. Yeah, some of the older macaques literally go up to the onsen and dip their toe in and go like that. One time I saw them sitting there, some of the older ones, and a little young one went running up, jumped up into the air and bombed into the middle, splashed everywhere, and the older ones around the edge were like, there's my parents. And everybody's going, oh, they're so like us. But part of my brain's going, yeah, but I suspect 2 hours ago you were down at Tokyo Station going, oh, the Japanese are so different to us. And it's like, so you find similarities with macaques, but differences with other humans. What's going on here? There's things to think about. Chapter 5, beliefs and practices. 20-something years ago, I went for a job interview at Cardiff University. And when I was chatting to one of the people who ended up becoming a colleague, I said, there are 2 things I will never, ever do research about in relation to Japan: literature and religion. So 7 years later, guess who's doing studies on literature and religion? I've already touched upon Climbers High. The novel came into that because of the crash and everything. Religion also comes in because of memorialization. So I've ended up doing both. Now, when we talk about religion in Japan, and I'm keeping an eye on some of the Japanese in the audience here, Japanese people often like to say, we're not religious. Which is why you see massive long queues for everybody going to shrines and temples in January, because of course you wouldn't do that because you're not religious. What do we mean by religion? How do these things play out in Japan? These are some of the things that the book discusses. I then go on to talk about the memorialization related to the JAL crash and the different aspects of it. But that then also allows to talk about a complete different side of things. Okay? Whereas memorialization can happen very easily here in different ways, at this place, Aokigahara, it can't. I would love not to talk about Aokigahara in this book at one level. I think for the 3rd edition, Stephanie, if you're watching, that's a hint, I will hopefully not include it. I think I include it at one level because there is so much Western interest in it, the Western media in particular. But I think what the problem is, both in Japan and with the outside media, is we're missing the important issue. Okay? Part of the discussion is here, people are going out here, and if they take their life here, they cannot be memorialized because we don't know when they died, which is very interesting juxtaposition to the previous thing. But the bigger issue that we're missing is the data and discussions on suicide and mental health in Japan. That is the debate that's not happening even in the Japanese media. Okay? And when you look at it in the Japanese media, they tend to focus on the headline figure, the number of people who've taken their lives. The population is going down, so we should expect the number to go down. If you look at the rate, it's not going down as quickly as it should be. Okay? There are things to be sorted out and discussed there. In relation to this, talking about suicide in Japan, it brings us on to kamikaze and sakura, cherry blossom, which brings me to talk a little story about the 1st edition. Sakura. Any of us who've been to Japan know this is what cherry blossom looks like in Japan. It's basically white. And I said to the publisher, let's have sakura on the front cover. And they go, no, we can't use that image, it's too white. It gets dirty too easily. This is despite the fact it has a big white circle in the middle. Okay, so we had a bit of a ding-dong. I kept on sending them different images. They kept on saying it's still too white. I would go on Photoshop, bump up the color a little bit, still too white. Eventually, I sent them this image. They said, perfect. And so that's one on the 1st edition. This wonderful Japanese cherry blossom from a tree 20 meters from my house in Cardiff. We see what we want to see. We believe what we want to believe. Also in this chapter, I talk about the service industry, including things like omotenashi, and talk about, is this actually a good thing? Does it lead to wastage? And that can tie back to discussions on the environment. Chapter 6 is the only chapter which has the same title as the 1st edition, but it's got no connection to the 3 Musketeers. If you'd like to know what the connection is, you can ask me later. Within this chapter, I can talk about a whole range of issues to do with additional beliefs and loyalty and so on. And if we're talking about loyalty, we have Hachiko. Hachiko was in the 1st edition. I was going to potentially not have a photograph of Hachiko in the 2nd edition. And I had some very vocal students who basically scrawled across my copy of the book saying, you must keep Hachiko-san. Hachiko is in there, which also allowed to show a different version of the scramble crossing in the background when there's no people around, which is also quite interesting as well. This chapter also allows me to talk about some other issues. For For example, the provision for those with disabilities. And here I'd like to particularly thank Maud Rowell, who helped me think about some of the issues facing blind people in Japan and elsewhere. And I've written before on my blog site and stuff, not enough of us actually talk about disabilities. We almost seem to just leave it to the people with disabilities to talk about what they're facing. No, it's for all of us to address and think about. And although Japan generally does better in many areas than the UK does, my experience going around Japan and seeing things, it's very patchy. And I personally think it's the patchiness, the inconsistency that can lead to problems. You don't know whether you're going to come to a crossing that does or does not have sounds. There's no way of knowing until you regularly go to that same crossing, for example. But at least when you have a crossing in Japan and you press a button, you don't have to worry about getting chewing gum on your hands like you do in this country. Chapter 7 is a chapter I wish I didn't have. Nationalism and internationalism, nationalisation and so on. But I get drawn naturally to this. It links in with my PhD topic. Having met and interviewed people like Prime Minister Nakasone and Tokyo Governor Ishihara, it's natural to talk about it. And because there is so much Western media attention on Japanese politicians, I mean, we've got a presidential debate for the LDP going on at the moment. I haven't looked, but potentially there'll be articles talking about the nationalist such and such. When Abe was around, he was an ultra-nationalist. What do these terms mean? And is it the same in Japan as it is in some other countries? So there's a discussion that needs to be had there. And then that allows me to go on to talk about national sport, which is an excuse to, one, bring up sumo, because I didn't have the other picture of sumo in there, and also talk about the world's greatest baseball team as well, and have a discussion about actually what is Japan's national sport? What do we mean by a national sport? We can then go on to talk about some other symbols of nationalism, the controversial Yasukuni Shrine, the even more controversial at one level museum next to it, and also the right-wing protests, in inverted commas. Note there's nobody actually watching other than a foreigner with a camera, but you sometimes see them. And then in this edition, which wasn't in the first edition, I've talked more about the self-defense forces. So last January, I went on a boat tour around Yokosuka, which was very interesting, seeing all these vessels of the Japanese Navy, the Maritime Self-Defense Force. I'm sure, maybe we have experts here from the maritime world, but can everybody tell me what sort of ship this is? It is not an aircraft carrier. This is a helicopter carrier. You should be able to see the difference. Okay? And I kid you not, these submarines on an international website, database of all military vehicles, defines these as being called attack submarines. Attack submarines, self-defense force. There are things we need to be thinking about here. When we think about Japan and some of these issues and what's happening with the military, it's important for us to not forget what happened here in Hiroshima and also in Nagasaki. And both of them still continue to play a role. But as more and more hibakusha die, we're getting to a point now where there are hardly any hibakusha left. Next year will be the 80th anniversary. It's probably the last round-numbered anniversary where there'll be hibakusha who actually remembered what happened. Because by 90, they would have been at best 5, 6 years old. Do they really remember what happened and so on? We have to remember what happened, because otherwise you'll get idiots like Putin and potentially from November or next January, Trump, thinking that it's okay to use these weapons. We need to keep this discussion going on. And Japan needs to remember it as well, because there have been discussions about Japan having nuclear weapons. Final chapter is then on transnationalism and isolation. Japan is part of the international community most of the time. Okay? And this chapter allows me to explore some of these. So within this diagram, we've got a picture up in the top left-hand corner here of the rugby stadium Kamaishi, one of the host cities for the Rugby World Cup. Incredibly successful event. But in that one, in the background and in the bottom ones, you can also see the huge defenses that have been built to stop future tsunami. Why are they built here but around Tokyo Bay and the south coast of Japan, which we all know is going to get hit? We thought it was happening last month by the Nankai Trough earthquake. Why are they building out in the Inaka? Things to be thinking about. Here we can see the number of visitors to Japan and how it's changed and how it was rocketing up until COVID. And then Japan entered its second sakoku. It was so difficult to get into the country. Some of the rules that were set up as the borders were gradually being opened, incredibly inconsistent, as I talk about in the book. One of the things to put into perspective with the number now rocketing back up again, I was in Japan in July. The number of foreigners who visited Japan in July was over 3 million, just for July. This is more than the total for the whole of 1989, which was the first year I visited Japan. That's how different it is now. Okay? We get used to the fact that now in many convenience stores, in particular in Japan, you are now getting served by foreigners, and you stand there looking at each other going, which language are we going to use here? Are we going to use Japanese, English? Neither, we're just touching, self-scanning, whatever, fine. Another thing we can look at is the difference between where visitors to Japan come from and where the Japanese themselves go to. Another issue, and this comes back to the problem with disabilities as well, is the patchiness and inconsistency. What languages are provided for those who don't understand Japanese? Sometimes it's just English. More often than not, you'll get Mandarin and Korean. Sometimes there's also Cantonese. Sometimes there are other European languages. Sometimes you have to follow a QR code. In a few places, you even get Portuguese. And you also get letterings, and sometimes, so this one you can't see it very clearly, but it's got a line number and stuff. They also use symbols. What's going on here? Finally, we get to the final picture, or pair of pictures, which actually, at one level, is the beginning of this book. In the first edition, I was talking about Tokyo 2020, the Olympics in the future. It's now past us, and so it was time to update the book and reflect upon the Olympics. So there's a section in the book thinking about the legacy of Tokyo 2020 and other events. And for the eagle-eyed amongst you, the top picture, you will also get to see on the very final slide as well. Now, finally, this background has appeared on all the slides. It is on the cover of the book. My question to you is, how many emoji are there? The answer, of course, is 42.